The story of Canada's founding begins not with a single moment, but with centuries of interaction, migration, and power struggles. Before European contact, the land we now call Canada was home to vibrant indigenous civilizations. The Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Cree, Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and many others had rich oral histories, political systems, and economies rooted in the land. Europeans arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, initially for fish and trade. In 1535, Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River and claimed the territory for France. But it wasn't until 1608 that Samuel de Champlain established a permanent French presence by founding Quebec City on the cliffs of Cap Diamant. This marked the beginning of New France. Champlain formed crucial alliances with the Huron-Wendat and Algonquin peoples, which helped secure access to the fur trade and provided military support. These alliances, however, brought New France into conflict with the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sparking decades of intermittent warfare. New France expanded its influence throughout the St. Lawrence Valley and into the Great Lakes and Mississippi regions. Its population, however, grew slowly. By 1750, the colony had only around 60,000 settlers, most of whom lived in small farming villages along the river. The colony's economy was based on agriculture, fur trading, and limited resource extraction, but France never prioritized mass settlement or strong military fortification. While the seigneurial system provided structure for rural life, most habitants lived modestly, bound by duty to their landowners and to the church. France sent only a few thousand troops to defend its North American holdings over the course of the 18th century. These were supplemented by local militia, often farmers with little formal training, and indigenous allies. In contrast, Britain's colonies to the south had grown rapidly and boasted over 1 million people. Backed by a powerful navy and far greater resources, Britain began to challenge France's dominance in North America. These tensions culminated in the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, a global conflict between European empires that spilled into their colonies. In North America, it is known as the French and Indian War. Initially, New France saw some success. Victories at Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757 boosted morale. French military strategy relied on speed, knowledge of terrain, and support from indigenous allies who engaged in guerrilla warfare. But this could not compensate for the numerical and logistical superiority of the British. In 1758, the British captured Louisbourg, severing France's access to supplies by sea. This opened the door to an assault on Quebec. In 1759, General James Wolfe led a British force of around 4,400 troops to Quebec. After weeks of failed assaults and a siege, Wolfe executed a daring plan. Under cover of night, his troops scaled the cliffs at Anse-au-Foulon and assembled on the Plains of Abraham. French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, leading approximately 4,500 soldiers, many of whom had just marched for days from a distant engagement and was forced to respond quickly. Exhausted and with limited time to prepare, Montcalm made the critical decision to confront the British immediately rather than wait for reinforcements. The ensuing battle lasted less than 30 minutes, but proved decisive. Wolfe and Montcalm both died from their wounds, but the British held the field. Quebec surrendered within days. In 1760, Montreal capitulated, marking the end of New France as a military power. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally ceded all French territories in mainland North America to Britain, though France retained a few islands. Around 70,000 French Canadians remained in the territory, now under British rule. Initially, Britain struggled to govern its new subjects. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 established the province of Quebec and attempted to impose English law and Protestant institutions. It also acknowledged indigenous land rights in theory, though this was rarely respected in practice. French Canadians resisted Anglicization, preserving their language, Catholic faith, and civil law traditions. In 1774, the British passed the Quebec Act, a significant shift in colonial policy. It restored French civil law, recognized Catholic rights, and expanded Quebec's borders into the Ohio Valley. While these measures placated many French Canadians, they infuriated American colonists, who saw the act as a threat. This contributed to the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1776. Though the Continental Army invaded Quebec, hoping to rally French Canadians to their cause, the effort failed. Most French Canadians remained neutral or loyal to Britain, valuing the cultural protections the Quebec Act had guaranteed. Following the Revolution, tens of thousands of Loyalists, Americans who remained loyal to Britain, fled north into British Canada. They settled in the Maritimes and in Quebec, often receiving land and support from the Crown. Their arrival reshaped the demographic and political landscape. To accommodate the growing English-speaking population, Britain passed the Constitutional Act of 1791, dividing Quebec into Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, and Lower Canada, modern Quebec, each with its own legislature and legal system. This laid the groundwork for future tensions and political reform. The seeds of Canada's complex dual identity, French and English, Indigenous and settler, had been planted during this early era. The rise and fall of New France was not simply a military defeat. It marked the beginning of a long and often difficult negotiation over identity, power, and coexistence that continues to shape Canada to this day. With the fall of New France in 1760 and its official cession to Britain in 1763, the future of Canada shifted dramatically. French Canadians suddenly found themselves under British rule, facing a new cultural and political order. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 tried to anglicize the population and impose British laws, but resistance ran deep. To avoid unrest, the British passed the Quebec Act in 1774, restoring French civil law and allowing Catholic worship. It was a strategic move to keep French Canadians loyal as Britain braced for the storm brewing to the south. When the American colonies rose in rebellion in 1776, they hoped to bring Quebec into the fold. But the French-speaking population largely stayed neutral or loyal to Britain, grateful for the protections granted by the Quebec Act. As the American Revolution ended and Loyalists fled north into British North America, the demographics changed rapidly. Over 40,000 Loyalists settled in what is now Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. To accommodate them, Britain split Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada in 1791. Upper Canada was mostly English-speaking Protestants. Lower Canada remained largely French and Catholic. While both had elected assemblies, real power rested with governors and appointed elites. Frustration grew, especially in Lower Canada, where French Canadians felt politically sidelined by an English-speaking business elite. That discontent exploded in the rebellions of 1837 and 1838. Reformers in both Canadas rose against colonial rule. Though the uprisings were crushed, they forced Britain to reevaluate its governance. Lord Durham's 1839 report recommended unifying the two Canadas and assimilating French Canadians into an English culture. He infamously described them as a people with no history and no literature. The Act of Union followed in 1841, merging Upper and Lower Canada into a single province of Canada. The hope was to drown French influence with English immigration. But French Canadians remained resilient. They protected their language, religion, and legal systems, ensuring their identity would not be erased. Meanwhile, the rest of British North America was evolving. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick had long histories as British colonies, and Prince Edward Island governed its own affairs. Westward, Rupert's Land and the Northwest Territories were vast indigenous homelands controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company. British Columbia, a remote colony tied to Pacific trade, stood apart. By the 1860s, several challenges made union appealing. The United States, after its Civil War, looked increasingly expansionist. The British wanted to reduce their military obligations in North America. Meanwhile, economic growth demanded better coordination between colonies. Railways, trade, and immigration required infrastructure beyond local control. In 1864, leaders from Canada East, Canada West, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick met in Charlottetown to discuss a federal union. They agreed on a confederation that would unite the colonies while allowing local control. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, with Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia as founding provinces. It was a constitutional monarchy with self-government in most domestic matters, while Britain retained control of foreign affairs. Confederation was a political compromise. It recognized the French presence by protecting Quebec's civil law and religious rights. But indigenous nations were excluded entirely. Treaties were signed on the prairies to open land for settlement, but they often misrepresented their terms. The Indian Act, passed in 1876, imposed control over indigenous governance, education, and culture. Residential schools sought to erase indigenous identity. Canada was expanding, but it came at great cost to the peoples who had lived on the land for millennia. Manitoba joined Confederation in 1870, following the Red River Resistance led by Louis Riel, a Métis leader who demanded rights for his people. British Columbia joined in 1871, lured by the promise of a transcontinental railway. Prince Edward Island came in 1873, after Canada agreed to pay off its debts. Alberta and Saskatchewan became provinces in 1905, carved from the growing population in the Western Territories. Newfoundland and Labrador held out the longest, finally joining Canada in 1949 after a closely contested referendum. Nunavut was created in 1999, granting the Inuit people a territory of their own. Throughout this growth, Canada faced growing pains. Regional tensions flared. Western provinces often felt alienated by decisions made in central Canada. Quebec, with its unique identity, continued to push for more autonomy. Two referendums in 1980 and 1995 nearly saw the province leave Confederation. Meanwhile, Indigenous peoples increasingly fought for recognition, land rights, and justice for past wrongs. Despite these tensions, Canada evolved from a cluster of colonies into one of the largest and most diverse nations in the world. It achieved full legislative independence with the Statute of Westminster in 1931 and patriated its constitution in 1982, adding the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The rise and fall of New France was only the first act in a much larger story. From the alliances of Champlain to the battle on the Plains of Abraham, from colonial rule to rebellion, and from confederation to reconciliation, Canada's journey has been shaped by cooperation, conflict, and compromise. The legacy of New France lives on in Quebec's culture and Canada's bilingualism, but the story of Canada includes many voices: French, English, Indigenous, and immigrant. Together, they built a nation rooted in diversity, still grappling with its past and striving toward a more inclusive future.